Hi there and welcome to Agronomag. Today's video is all about hay farming essentials and a comprehensive guide to growing hay. Hay farming may seem like a very simple venture to chase, but in reality there are a lot of facets to it that very few people know about. This is why for today's video we decided to teach you everything you need to know about hay farming. Through this video we hope to educate you on what you need to start hay farming, what you should look out for, and most importantly, what no one tells you about. So, if you want to find out more about hay farming, then keep on watching because we're just getting started. So firstly, back to the basics of what is hay. Hay is, in essence, just like any other plant, but in order to prepare it to be served as animal feed, it needs to undergo the following processes: the cutting process, the drying up process, and the storing up. As far as what plants you can use as hay, there are lots of different options for you to consider, including, but not being limited to, the following: ryegrass, timothy, brome, fescue, Bermuda grass, orchard grass, clovers, and alfalfa. The main factor that goes behind which plant you should use is the location you want to work in. For example, in Iowa, the most commonly used plants are the alfalfa and the clover. Then you have hay versus straws. So a lot of people believe that hay and straws are all the same thing, but they're sadly mistaken. Hay is made out of the stems, leaves, and seed heads of plants that are fresh. Hay is then cut and baled only when it reaches its most nutritional value, when it can be used to feed the livestock. Straw, on the other hand, may also be made out of stems and leaves, but it is cut right after the plants have been allowed to mature. As such, straws have a very low nutritional value, so it is not recommended to feed them to your animals. Instead, straws are used as bedding for animals, especially so considering just how soft and comfortable they are for them. Ever since man first tamed the wild animals that Mother Nature gave birth to, we have been using many different plants to feed them. The very first farmers would cut down the prairie grasses and use them to feed their livestock. Around the 20th century, by far the most popular grasses to be used as hay were timothy grass and clover. It didn't take long before alfalfa replaced both of these grasses though, completely taking over in Iowa even to this day. Still, it is believed that alfalfa is native to Central Asia, where it was also used back in the day to feed animals. Alfalfa spread quicker than ever before after farmers realized just how easy to grow and nutritious it was for their animals. Nowadays, alfalfa is the main plant used for hay, and while that isn't to say that no other plants are used anymore, it is still the uncontested most popular choice for most people. So now you're wondering, how do crops become hay? So as mentioned previously, in order to turn your crops into hay, you just need to follow the following steps. You need to cut them up, dry them up next, and then bale them. After this point, you will need to store them in such a way as to make sure that they will hold onto the nutrients for an extended period of time. Keep in mind that storing the hay is actually the most important part of the process, as the moment that hay becomes wet, it loses all of its nutrients. With that being said, here is what you should know about each step in the process. First of all, cutting hay. When it comes to cutting the hay, there are more than a handful of ways that you can choose from to get the job done. Firstly, by hand. This is by far the most commonly used practice. It has been done for thousands of years now using handheld tools such as the scythe, for example. By horse-drawn machines, this method was first introduced around the 19th century as a response to people owning larger crops of land than ever before. During this time period, a lot of different hay mowers were invented that were meant to be pulled with horses. Then you had by machine pulled by a tractor. As soon as tractors were invented, hay mowers were also improved upon so that they could be pulled by them. The next step in the process is drying up the hay. Before you can even think about drying the hay, you should consider baling it. That's because when the hay is cut, farmers leave it in the field and they allow it to partially dry. The farmers will then gather up and rake the hay together into what is referred to as windrows. Keep in mind that any sort of moisture will completely destroy your hay here, so yes, if it rains during this time frame, you will lose out on a lot of hay. Just a little rain will simply slow down the drying process, but too much of it will cause the hay to begin to spoil in the field, which is the opposite of what you want. Then you have baling hay. Interestingly enough, baling equipment has been around since the late 1800s, but these early machines were nothing like what we have today. In fact, the baling machines from back in the day were stationary, and so you had to pick up the hay, take it to the machines to get it baled. You would either carry the hay by hand, or you would technically use wagons to move the hay to the hay balers, where the machine would then press the hay into square bales. By the time the year 1930 rolled around, hay baling equipment evolved to the point where it can now be pulled by tractors around. As such, you would no longer have to worry about picking up the hay from the ground, and instead you could just move the machines to where you had the hay in the first place. This was incredible for the farmers for multiple reasons. It saved them a lot of time, It saves them a lot of energy, and it also made the process easier for them. Now, where to store the hay? Here, stacking is known as the oldest method of storing hay, to the point where we can't say for sure when it was first used. Still, what we do know is that back in the 1840s and 1850s, these stacks would sometimes be used as housing for the animals, although this wouldn't last for long. A few decades later, the farmers would build large barns that would be able to store more than just tools and seed. These large barns would also be used to store the hay, which would usually be stacked in the centre of the place. By the time the 1900s came, loose hay would be stored in the barn, and the hay would then be carried by wagon to the barn, where it would be stored into the hayloft. Now we've covered that, let's take a look at some interesting facts about hay. In this brief segment, we will guide you through some of the most interesting fun facts we could find relating to hay. For example, how many acres of hay were harvested in Iowa back in the day? In the early 1900s, as much as 2,577,000 acres of hay were harvested. In the year 1957, 3,744,000 of acres of hay were harvested, breaking records that would not be surpassed even to this day. Nowadays, in the year 2016, only 910,000 acres are stored nowadays in Iowa, so you could technically say that the business's heydays are over by now. Another interesting bit of trivia we have in store for you is how many tons of hay were produced in Iowa in the following years. In the early 1900s, 3,608,900 tons were produced. By the time the year 1957 rolled up, a record of 7,938,000 tons of hay were produced. By the time 2016 rolled around, less than 3,210,000 tons were produced. Last but not least, we would like to mention how the value of the hay crop changed in Iowa over those years. So in the early 1900s, the value of the hay crop that were produced here reached a total of $23,458,656,000. By the time the year 1957 rolled around, the value was increased to $123,039,000. And as of 2016, the value more than doubled, reaching a total of $294,915,000. How about hay farming today? The processes we've mentioned so far may sound a bit prehistoric by now, but keep in mind that not much has changed as far as what you need to do to prepare the hay for usage. Still, because you do have access to more advanced technology and equipment, here's what you will need to know. Firstly, preparing the soil. Preparing the soil is actually a lot easier than you think. You just need to do the same thing you would do with any other vegetable crop. Farmers will test the soil to determine if any fertilizers need to be added. After this point, you will add the fertilizer if needed. Next up, just get rid of all the weeds on the field, since their presence alone will make it difficult for your plants to grow. Then you have planting and growing the plants. If you do plan on reusing the same field over and over again to grow hay, you will not need to worry about replanting every year. But if you do plan on using hay as a part of a crop rotation, you will need to plant them on a yearly basis. With that being said, the hay seed can be a mixture of multiple types of seed, including the following. Alfalfa, as we mentioned previously, is the number one pick for most people, clover and timothy. And as far as spreading the seeds is concerned, you can do it in one of two ways. You can spread it by hand. This option is preferred for small areas, or you can use machines such as grain drills to get the job done. This is better for larger areas. Cutting up the hay. This is the fun part, the part where you'll be able to cut it all down and make the most out of it. But when exactly should you start cutting up the hay? Well, it should be done specifically when it has the most nutritional value. This is usually around 60 days after, although it can differ depending on the seeds you use to make them. The good thing about cutting up the hay is that you can use the same field multiple times per season. Nowadays, you will find two different types of mowers that are actively used to cut up the hay. These mowers can also be pulled by machines. Firstly, there are rotary disc mowers. These are the mowers that have those signature round discs attached to them. Then there's sickle bar mowers. These are the mowers that have a bar full of teeth that is used to cut down the hay. Back in the early 20th century, hay baling equipment was still in its infancy, but as more and more time passed, things started to change for the better. Before long, a machine was invented that could make round hay bales. That may sound like an insignificant change to you, but this was a revolutionary invention to say the least. While the original machinery was great in all, it definitely lacked in more than one way, which is where a group of students from the Iowa State University came into play. They were the ones that came up with an improved design for this machine, which was improved even further in the mid-1960s by an engineer named Wesley Bucale. He created a huge mechanical baling machine that could easily produce a giant 700 pound or 320 kilogram round bale. Using this machine, the farmer could harvest the plants, bale and transport them to the livestock without ever even laying a hand on the hay. Transporting and storing the hay. Transporting the hay is usually done in one of two ways. By moving each bale with a tractor, the only downside to this is that it takes a very long time to do, and by putting multiple bales of hay onto a wagon and pulling it to where you need it. As far as the storing process is concerned, regardless of whether you go for square or round bale, you will need either a barn or a different building with a roof to keep it dry. If you keep it outside, you will have to constantly worry about the weather damaging the nutritional quality of the hay. The different uses of hay. For the most part, hay is only really used as feed for livestock. With that being said, you can use hay as feed for most or any animal on the farm, including cows, horses, sheep and goats. If you can't get your livestock to graze or be on a pasture, feeding them hay is the only other option you have. Depending on the animal you're feeding though, they will need different nutritional requirements. So for this part, you will need to carefully monitor the food that your animal is consuming and look out for any signs that something is wrong. If your hay is rotten, your animals will either not eat it or they will consume it and get sick from it.